Welcome Life Science learners to another installment for you guys. Hope you guys are well and that you're ready for your next installment of the human impact on the environment. Today we're focusing on food security. As a reminder, remember that in grade 11 this topic is covered, but it also is needed for you to recollect in grade 12. This is a topic that's assessed with water security, food availability, human impact in terms of the biomes and biodiversity. All of that is in your papers in grade 12. So let's get straight into the lesson. Let's have an overview of what food security is. Let's try and unpack what it means to have secure food in a country. And then we'll look at some factors that affect food security in the context of the world as well as the context of South Africa. I think these are important in terms of understanding what the concept of food security is in a country where the stability of food and the access of food is something that we don't take for granted. So let's get straight into the topic. So, have you ever thought about the following? There are many factors that contribute to today's food security crisis. One factor is, how is climate change having an impact on that? And so guys, we often talk about factors such as the cost of living, consequences of inflation. However, have we thought about the impact that climate change has on food security? So globally, we've spoken about things that happen in the context of the world, global warming. Have we considered the impact of global warming on food production? How weather patterns have changed and have affected the production of food? So these are important concepts that we need to look at when we discuss food security. So, a choice of questions that are presented for you, but the first one is going to challenge you, and I want you guys to look at the following question and possibly look at these options as we get through the lesson today. So, what is food security? A, the state of not being able to access reliable source of nutritious, healthy, and affordable food. B, the state of being able to access reliable source of nutritious, healthy, and affordable food. Or C, the same as food insecurity. Or D, all of the above. So guys, let's kind of understand exactly what we mean by food security and food insecurity. And so we'll try and unpack that, and hopefully at the end of this session you should be able to answer this question as you understand what the context of food security or food insecurity means. So let's have an overview of our concepts that we're going to discuss in our lesson today. So as we unpack this lesson, we're going to look at what is food security. We're also going to look at factors affecting food security. We're going to spend some time looking at what is hunger in South Africa and what is the ratio of people that are actually facing food insecurity. We're going to look at levels of food security. We're also going to discuss factors that increase food insecurity in the context of South Africa. Okay, some key words and concepts that we will unpack during the course of this lesson. So it's important for us to understand what is food security. We need to look at the concepts of how the availability of food, its affordability, and its accessibility all linked to food security. So often we need to not just look at the accessibility, but also the cost of that food and whether it's available to the population in a country. We also need to look at human exponential population growth as a factor that influences the availability of food. We're going to look at the concept of monoculture as a farming method that affects food security. We also need to discuss the context of what invasive plants are and how they impact on the local indigenous food crops. We're going to spend some time looking at gene pool as a point of evaluating what the impact of genetic modified crop have, and as a point of discussion what seed banks are and how they secure plants for the future. The image is obviously showing kind of very colorful food and obviously an indication of the quality of food that is available. And I think that's also a factor that we need to look at. It's not just the food, but in terms of the quality of food and how this healthy, nutritious food is available. And what are the factors that determine how these nutritious nutritious and healthy food is produced. So when we unpack what food security is, let's look at that definition as a concept. So food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient food that is safe, nutritious, and that meets the dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And this was a definition that was unpacked at the Committee for World Food Security. And so it's not just having food, it's looking at being able to have nutritious food, not when it's convenient, but at the required daily amounts of people in a context of a country or a population in an area. So food security is not just the access to food, but it's also the access to food that is safe, that is nutritious, but also that meets the demands, the dietary needs of an active citizen. So you've got to look at that. So many countries have access to food, some populations have access to food, but is it a balanced diet that they have access to? Is it a diet that consists of all the food groups? And we often see that in the context of a country like Africa, we see some countries that have a high production of maize, but these populations lack access to proteins, fish and meat. And so you find there are certain malnutrition disorders that appear in these populations. So we say that that is a country that is affected by food security because it does not meet the requirements of food security in terms of balanced diet, meeting the nutritious requirements of that population, as well as the affordability and accessibility of the food to that population. So let's remember that in terms of the context of what food security is in a country. Right, so what is food security is something that we've just been looking at. Let's continue to look at what are the factors that determine what different levels of food security are in our next segment. So when we talk about levels of food security, essentially we're talking about the different aspects of what the food security means to a population. So while households often described as either food secure or food insecure, there are 4 levels that we need to look at of food security that describes the ranges of households experiencing the accessing of enough food. Let's look at this. So households with high food security as the first level, and the second level, households with marginal food security. These make up the food secure category. And households with low food security, that's the third group. And those with very low food security make up the other group of the insecure category. And I've illustrated that in this illustration here. So we see that there are 4 levels, and these are the groups that are probably having most secure access to food. However, the 2 levels at the bottom are the levels that are experiencing food insecurity, with the level right at the bottom being least insecure of food. And this means that they probably don't have access to regular food, they are not having access to quality, nutritious food, and it means that the cost and availability of this food is a factor that determines their accessibility to this food. So it's important that we understand that food is available, but there are different ranges of that food availability. And that's essentially what we're talking about when we differentiate the levels of food security in the context of a country, in the context of globally, how populations are different. And this often comes from looking at developed countries to developing countries. And I think that's important in terms of understanding the context of food security in a country. Okay, cool. So we're going to unpack more concepts now, and now we're looking at the factors that affect food security. And so when we talk about factors that affect food security, we're going to unpack these, and as we get through this lesson, we're going to try and unpack in the context of South Africa what those are specifically. So globally, we know that the populations of humans are growing exponentially, and we'll talk about that as an impact. We know that droughts and floods as a result of climate change have affected food security. Farming practices in terms of how they cope with the demands of a global increasing population have been a factor that affects food security. We know that there's loss of wild varieties due to impact on the gene pool. We know that human activity on terms of monoculture has also affected the wild varieties. We also need to look at how genetically modified food could both impact positively as well as negatively on food security. And a factor that also influences food security is the wastage of food. And this wastage of food comes from both from a consumer perspective as well as from a production perspective. Cool. So as I said, the first factor that we need to unpack is the human population growth. And so this graph illustrates the population over a period of time. And here we've extrapolated what the population is approximately in 2010 and what the population is expected to be in the year 2050. And as we look at the key on this graph, we can see that the red line shows that there's been an exponential increase in the world population in the last, probably in the next 50 years' time. Let's look at what the current food production is. And if you see this, the current food production is probably sufficiently meeting the demands of the population at the moment. However, the question arises, what would happen to food production in the future? In the future, in the context of what would happen when the population exceeds at an exponential rate? Would our current methods of food production meet the requirements of an exponentially growing population? So scientists are looking at this and they are able to extrapolate that currently our ways of producing food and the current demands that we have from our producers are not going to be sufficient to sustain an increasing global population. This would mean that we now need to look at more futuristic food production technology. So in the context of that, genetically modified food and more advanced food producing mechanisms in terms of advanced hydroponics, agricultural methods that involve more developed irrigation systems. So those are concepts that need to be looked at. And so there's a lot of investment in securing food availability for the future, not just from the accessibility of food, but also from the production of food that needs to be wholesome, that needs to be safe, as well as affordable for an increasing global population. So the human population has grown significantly since 1750, tripling from about 800 million to 2.5 billion by 1950. And we know that in 1985, it doubled again to 5 billion, and it's currently around 7.8 billion. So that has been an exponential growth. However, we have not seen that increase in food production yet. It is estimated that the human population will be about 10 million by the year 2050. What does this mean? This means that we're going to continue with an exponential increase. This will put a lot of pressure on our basic resources for food production. And this presents a challenge for us. It is predicted that the demand for food will increase by 70% by the year 2050. This creates challenges. So the challenges that are faced by the agricultural sector is not only to produce 70% more food, but also to make 70% more food accessible. And that's the key component to the production of food. It's not about just producing the food, it's about making that food accessible as well as affordable to the global population. And I think if we consider that food production is just one aspect, we've got to remember that making that food accessible and making it affordable also come in hand with that. So technology has improved, but we've also got to look at how technology could make the affordability of food much more accessible. So guys, we've looked at food security. Now we're looking at factors that affect food security. In this segment, we've discussed the human impact on that. You guys deserve a break. I think if you can go and access some snacks with some water, grab on that, and then we'll get back to the next session where we can talk about other factors that affect food security in the global context. Have a little break and I'll see you in a bit. Welcome back, life science learners. As we got into the break, we looked at food security. I hope you guys have secured something to help you through this session. Grab on a snack and let's look at that. But also, while you're snacking on that, think of what went into that to ensure that you were able to access that food today. So we're going to continue looking at factors that influence food security. We've looked at the global impact of an exceeding human population, or an exponential human population. Let's look at droughts and floods. Let's link this to what we've done already in the past, where we've looked at how climate change has affected the temperatures and agriculture as a factor that we need to consider. So think of what happens when global warming has occurred and how that has affected the ability of farmers to be able to now irrigate their crops. So farmers would need to spend more time and more money on irrigating their crops. This has a cost factor on the consumer. Why? Because it costs more money to irrigate your crops. It means that farmers now need to put in much more stringent mechanisms to ensure that their crops grow. And this in turn affects the affordability of food. So globally, we've got to look at how the cost of food is increasing because of drought as well as floods. Again, link that to climate change. So let's get straight into this and unpack other factors that affect global food security. So when we look at droughts and floods, remember that there are severe changes that we discussed that occur because of climate change. And these are projected to affect the livelihoods as well as consequently food security. Droughts and floods have become frequent, and the loss of livelihoods is linked to this. Migration and insecurity are also linked to the impact that floods and droughts have had on food security. This will cause the resources to become less, so we call that degradation, as well as environmental degradation that occurs. And this in turn leads to poor harvest and food security or insecurity. So again, as I explained, global temperatures, when they change, they're going to definitely affect the ability of farmers to be able to irrigate their crops. We know that floods have become more frequent and our droughts have become even more frequent, sometimes longer. And this means that we don't have proper irrigation, we don't have proper water which is naturally available during our summers when it rains. And so we experience these droughts that in turn affect food production. Right, so here's an image that shows you the impact that a drought has. So farmers that experience this are affected by huge economic losses. And these losses in turn are then incurred on by the consumer. Why? Because the cost of producing these increase, and hence the availability of food in the next season also is affected. And so droughts play a significant role in food security. Poor farming practices. When we consider the next factor, think of what happens in a country that has got advanced farming techniques, and we compare that to subsistence farmers that use the traditional methods of farming. So poor farming practices affect food security by causing damage or destruction to the soil, crops, and livestock. Water is essential for food production, and if it's wasted or contaminated, it means that there's less food that is produced. So farming practices have changed over time. However, if subsistence farmers have not practiced more improvised modern farming techniques, we're going to find that their production of food decreases. It means that their availability and access to food also is compromised. So as we've got factors such as global climate change, droughts and floods that are affecting commercial farmers, we know that if you haven't changed and evolved in terms of the techniques that you're using to produce food, you're going to find that this will affect food security and lead to further loss of food availability to consumers in that in the context of those markets that farmers are producing food at. So we also need to look at what farming practices that are not ideal and how they affect the ability for farmers to produce food. So we talk of monoculture, where a farmer is producing the same crop for several seasons. And monoculture has been led to the degradation of the soil, the extraction of more nutrients from the soil, eventually leading to a decrease in productivity from that specific land. So monoculture for commercial reasons can affect the production in the long term. We also know that pest control, so the ability of a farmer to control the pests that affect his crop is something that he needs to consider. However, pest control can also impact on the quality of food. It also can impact on the biodiversity that's present. And so, in turn, pest control needs to be carefully monitored to ensure that you're able to produce food that's consumable, but also to conserve the biodiversity in that area. The loss of topsoil. And you know that the topsoil is that soil that's the most fertile soil. And so as we have monoculture and overgrazing, we know that these can degrade the quality of plants that grow there. And in turn, when there is a loss of the plants that grow on that surface, we're going to find that there's nothing to hold the soil on the surface. So we see that when we have rains, it washes off the topsoil, and that topsoil takes away all the nutrients with the rain. And this ends up the land becoming poor in terms of the nutritive ability for them to sustain a new crop in the next season. So this occurs over years of time, and then eventually leading to the land becoming arid, and we say not suitable for commercial or even for planting food crops on them. We also know that not using fertilizer is a factor that also affects food productivity. So farmers are encouraged to use the proper fertilizers, nitrates, phosphates that are needed for plant growth. And so not being able to use the fertilizers means that whatever is in the soil naturally is then extracted over years, leading to the soil being actually deplenished of the required nutrients that the plants need. So there's also the loss of wild varieties due to the impact of gene pool. Now we'll talk about what gene pool means. So the most modern food crops are breeds that originated through selective breeding of wild plants and animals. So we refer to that as selective breeding. So over years, our commercial food crops that we currently consume have been selected from wild varieties that existed thousands of years ago. And over a period of time, farmers have selected these plants and have crossed them to produce what we currently consume that are viable in terms of the production, the yield, the aesthetic appeal. And so because of selective breeding, we might have incorporated some of the bad genes or the recessive genes, and these genes increase the vulnerability of these crops that we're currently growing for consumption. So these crops are sometimes not as resistant to disease or to changes in global temperature. So when these factors affect, when these plants are affected by factors such as increased global temperatures or an infestation from a pest, we will see that because of a lack of variety, that these plants succumb to those factors, thus in turn affecting food security. So we got to think about a way to circumvent that. So biologists and biotechnologists have considered genetically modified food crop, and these food crops would include genes that have been inserted into them to make them resistant to drought, to resistant to pest, or to give them additional qualities that enhance the nutritional value of a food crop. And we've seen that a lot of research has gone into producing the food that we currently consume, and that ensures that we have accessibility to food in the context of factors that are affecting the natural growth of these food crops. Wastage of food is a significant factor that affects food security. And when we try and understand what wastage of food means, it simply does not necessarily mean what's left over on the dinner table. There's also a lot of wastage of food that happens in the production and the commercial retail of food. So when you visit a supermarket, if that packet of spinach has become frail and it looks unconsumable or doesn't look appealing, there's a loss to the farmer and there's a loss to the retailer. This will in turn impact the sale of food and will also pick up the price of the production of food. So the loss of food is not necessarily just from the consumption. Please don't get me wrong. Also, leaving food on your plate and wasting that food also affects the cost of food. So the more we waste, it means that the farmers are producing food that is now not being consumed and being thrown into landfills and dumps. That further increases the cost of food. Let's look at the cost of transporting food and how that affects the food. So during the transportation of food from a farmer to a retail outlet, there's a lot of refrigeration and correct techniques that are used in transferring them. So the processing of that. So in that time, if the processing of that food does not occur efficiently, we will experience food that will be wasted. Why? Because that food does not reach the consumer in a state that is nutritious. So there's a lot of food wasting that happens from the producer, which is the farmer, to the consumer, which is us. So understanding exactly where this wastage occurs is crucial to effectively improving our food systems. For an example, food is lost or wasted in the production, as I mentioned, in the storage and the transportation stages. It can result in reduced food availability and increased vulnerability of our foods in our food systems. So, as I mentioned, if a truck is transporting food and that truck is not well refrigerated, it means that the fresh produce that comes to the consumer now has undergone some kind of wastage, or it has decreased the quality of that food. So again, farmers need to consider the transportation of that food to the consumer. And all of these impact on the wastage of food. The wastage of food is currently around 1.8 billion tons, my apologies, of food that is wasted each year. And if you think about that globally, that's a significant amount of food, 1.8 billion. So let's look at what this means. This amounts to as much as 1/3 of all food produced. So it means that if we're consuming, 9 billion tons, 3 billion tons of that is actually being wasted in the production. It's wasted on your table. It's wasted in the transportation of food. And that's a significant amount of food that's wasted. Remember that some of the food also is not consumed by the sell-by date. And so that's also wasted. So food loss represents waste of land, water, energy, financial, agrichemical, and mechanical inputs. So there's a knock-on effect on the supply and the demand of food. So it's not just the wasting of the food, but there's an economic impact on throughout the chain line and the processing of food. And so this is significant in us trying to understand what wastage of food means. So on this graph, I've indicated to you what is the difference between the developing countries and the developed countries, and how the pre-harvest, post-harvest, and the food wastage are compared. So let's try and understand what this graph actually illustrates. So it shows the stages at which food is lost between the farm and the consumer. So post-harvest is after the production of it. This represents over 60% of all food loss in developing countries. So let's look at the comparisons between a developed country, which is in light green, and a developing country in a darker shade of the green. So when we talk of pre-harvest loss, so this is before farmers have actually produced harvested their crop, we can see that your developed countries have a significantly higher pre-waste loss. And this talks to essentially their techniques that they use in the production of food. If we look at the post-harvest loss, so this is when we talk about what happens from the producer all the way to the consumer in the transportation and getting that to the consumer. We can see that in developing countries there is a significantly higher post-harvest loss. And this links to their techniques, their transportation mechanisms, their storage facilities, as well as the quality of the food that is produced. And so this means that our developed countries with their more modern and developed techniques of transporting, storage, means that there's significantly reduced loss of food. If we look at food wastage, sadly, and if we compare that to the two developed and developing countries, you can clearly see that developed countries have a significantly larger proportion of food wastage when compared to your developed countries. or developing countries. And the reasons for why this happens is, remember that in developing countries, a lot of the farmers are using food for subsistence, so they produce some of that food and they consume some of that food. However, if we talk about our developed countries, a lot of that food is taken to the consumer, it's stored, it's their lifestyle that people kind of waste food through. So there's wastage of food on the plate, there's wastage of food in the storage. So we find that if you go to a supermarket and if it has a sell-by date, and if that is not consumed before the sell-by date, that is regarded as wastage. So that unfortunately or fortunately does not happen when we talk of your developing countries. Often farmers grow what they need, they supply them freshly, and that is available to the consumer immediately. So in terms of the supply and demand, there's significantly less wastage. So guys, we've looked at food wastage, we've looked at the difference between what happens in developing countries and what happens in developed countries, and significantly the production and the consumption of food is also factors that we need to consider when we think about wastage. So the next time that you are having a meal and you decide to not consume or finish off your food, think about the impact that has had on the food security. So remember, I know that your parents often remind you to finish off your meals and not to waste, and there's a significant impact that that waste has on not just the production, but the consumption and the cost of producing that. So consider that, guys. So you guys have done well. You guys deserve a break. Let's tune in after a little break, and I'll see you in a bit. Welcome back, Life Science learners, to our third segment. So we've looked at food security. We were discussing what are the factors that affect food security globally. Let's look at some of the factors that are affecting food security in the context of South Africa. And I think it's important that we understand the context of what is happening in our country. And I think it's important that we consider these when we look at food security globally. So we are quite unique in factors that affect food security in South Africa. So we're going to unpack this to some detail, and then we're going to look at how we can be applying this to the context of food security. So factors that have increased food insecurity in South Africa currently is the effect of the pandemic COVID-19 on us, environmental factors, as well as farm attacks. Let's try and understand what each of these have meant in terms of food security in the context of South Africa. Guys, we know the impact that COVID has had in terms of, firstly, job security. We know that this has affected the livelihoods of many people in terms of affordability. We know that there are many workers that have not been able to return to work. And so it also has impacted on farmers that have required laborers to actually carry out their hard, intensive labor. So from a production perspective, to an affordability, to a consumption of food, the pandemic has significantly affected us. Think about the financial impact that lockdown has had on the availability of funds and people earning an income. So that also has affected the availability of food and security of food in the context of South Africans consuming food. So we've experienced one of the strictest lockdowns in the world between July 2020 to current. Most of the economy was forced to shut down, and non-essential services were told to close during this period. And as I mentioned, this means that the ability to earn an income was affected. Okay. We also know that South Africa is experiencing periods of extreme drought, and these droughts have tended to last for much longer than naturally have been. And so this means that the production of food and the cost of irrigation has also escalated. Again, that has a significant impact on security of food. So this has been a long threat to South Africa's agricultural industry and food production. And we know that if we look along the Free State and we look at the impact that drought has had, so that has severely affected the production of wheat, sunflower, and maize. And so this is significant in us in trying to understand the impact that environmental factors have had. farm attacks. We know that there's been an increase in fear and outrage amongst farmers of the invasion and the attacks occurring on their land. And so this is also significantly impacted on the livelihood of farmers and their investment in the production of food. So if we think about farm attacks, yes, farmers have lost their lives, but however, if they've lost their lives, it means that their interest in continuing to maintain farms has also been affected. So remember that farm attacks have a knock-on effect on the production of food as well as on the consumer. So if we don't have farmers, it means that we don't have food, and that again affects the security of food in a country. So it's something that we need to consider in terms of the context of a South African context in terms of food availability to people in our country. So if we now look at hunger in South Africa, what does it mean for a South African to access food? And that's essentially what we need to know. So did you know that in 2017, 6.8 million South Africans experienced hunger? What does that mean in terms of hunger? While this number has dropped to 13.5 million in 2002, hunger still affects 1.7 million households across the country. And so this is significant in terms of looking at the stats in a graph. So in 2017, 6.8 million South Africans experienced hunger. What does hunger mean? And hunger is also, again, an impact of food security. So people that don't have access to food, do not have a meal on a daily basis, a nutritious meal, experience hunger. And if we look at this, let's try and understand what that has meant for an average South African household. So the number of households that experienced hunger was in 2002. If we look at people and then if we look at households, we can see that there was 13.5 million people that experienced hunger, and gradually that has decreased to 6.8 million. However, this is still staggering. If you think about it, in 2017, 6.8 million people or households were affected by hunger. However, if we look at the 2.7 million in 2002, and this is a graph that points to the households, we can see that again 1.7 million households were affected. So although the stats look promising, where we're seeing a decline in both individuals and households, it is still significantly large proportions of the populations and households that are experiencing hunger. And that is, again, it talks to the culture of us consuming food, producing food in a way that ensures that its security is maintained. Right. So we've looked at factors in South Africa, we've looked at hunger in South Africa. Let's take some questions that are related to the food security and its availability to people in the context of South Africa. So study the table on the next slide and answer the questions that follow. So here we've got a table that illustrates different countries. It shows you the total kg and it shows you the developing regions of the world. So it's classifying them as developing or developed, and so there's an emphasis on the words developed and developing. And it shows you the food loss and wastage per person in a year. So that's significant in terms of trying to understand. So it's further broken down to at the production and retail, and then by the consumers. And so if we look at the stats in this, it's good to be able to identify the difference between, so where here we have a developed country, an industrialized Asia, which is a developed country. We also see that there are developing countries that are illustrated. So Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, West and Central Asia, South and Southeast Asia, and Latin America are all seen as developing countries. So I think that's very important in us trying to understand the context of what this comparison is being made against. So we're comparing your developing countries to your developed countries further up here. And so again, these stats that we need to compare is something that you need to extrapolate and pay careful attention to. So generally, if you look at the trend, we can see that at the production and retail stages, we can see that these countries that are developed have a significantly larger production of loss. If you compare that to Your developing countries, although they have a significantly smaller, we also see that across, in terms of by the consumer, a significantly reduced loss by the consumer. However, if we compare that to the developed countries, we can see that these numbers are significantly higher. And again, as I mentioned, when we spoke about the wastage of food, unfortunately, some of our developed countries tend to waste significantly higher amounts of food. And that talks to lifestyle, it talks to the quality of food, it talks to the production of food as well. So let's consider those factors when we're trying to understand this question. Right, so for Sub-Saharan Africa, calculate the food wastage by consumer as a percentage of the total food waste. So we've got to look at, for Sub-Saharan Africa, this is that group that we're looking at, and we've got to look at the food wastage by the consumer as a percentage of the total food produced. So on the next slide, I've indicated that in a slide. So we've got to take and look at, so there's 5 by 160. So we're looking at the 5 there, and we're looking at the 160 because that's the total that was produced. And of that, there's 5 kilograms of that are wasted. So as a proportion, we've got to work out 5 out of 160 times 100, and that should give you, punch in those numbers into a calculator, and it gives you a 3.1% loss of food wastage, which is significantly low when we compare that to the other countries that are much developed. Cool. The next question, suggest a reason for this low percentage calculated in question 1.3. So we said that it is about, if we go back to that slide, it's about 3.1%. So we've got to suggest why is there such a low percentage of wastage. And as we discussed this earlier on, remember that access to food is scarce, and the food that is available is either provided by the international aid agencies or by subsistence farmers. So when a country is experiencing poor availability of food, the tendency to waste food is significantly less. So if you don't have enough, you're not going to waste. However, on the contrary, if a country has a lot of food and there's good quality of food that's easily available, one has choices, and one might actually by nature choose to consume some and waste the other. However, that's not the case in countries that are affected by poverty or affected by the ability to access that food, and clearly we see that here. So there's very little food that is bought, and even less that is bought from supermarkets. So we refer to that as being subsistence consumption. And we see that there's a lot of food that is produced by the farmers and that are consumed by them. So it means that as they eat, as they use, they eat. And so there's very little wastage. So there's no food that is left over to waste, or the food that is produced is consumed fresh, and that's produced as per their need, or it's harvested as per their need. So the ability for farmers to conserve and consume food in a sustainable way is significantly higher in a developing country, as we've seen. Right, so the next question, explain the difference in the pattern of food wastage in a developed and developing regions. So if you look at the table, as I pointed out, you can see that in our developing countries and our developed countries, you can see the wastage here is significantly lower, whereas in our developed countries, it's significantly higher. So for 4 marks, we've got to explain that difference. And I've done that in the next slide, so I've pointed that out to you, and I said to you that if you look at these, the wastage is significantly lower. However, if you look at these developed countries, you can see that it's significantly higher when we compare them by each region. So what does this mean? So in developed regions, people buy food from markets, they buy them from shops and supermarkets, often in excess. And this will be unused or thrown away. Often when you open your fridge and if you see that there's something that has been lying there for quite some time, the tendency for us to consume that decreases. So if the fruits or the vegetables have turned a bit fraught, we tend to kind of throw that away. However, that does not happen. If you were to pluck that fresh from your garden, you would consume that immediately, and hence you would not be wasting significantly large volumes of food. And that's what we see. Okay, so the market shops and supermarkets will also throw away unsold food, as you would see in many supermarkets where you've got food that is dated, and so that is not consumed, it's then thrown away or it's used to feed animals. In developing regions, people will depend more on small, local sources of food. They have less food security and will have no food in excess of their needs, and will not have food in excess of their needs. So we look at that. State 2 possible ways of preventing the high level of food wastage that is found in developing countries. And so guys, we know that we're often reminded about how to conserve and reduce our wastage of food. Possible ways would be to prevent food loss, and that would mean prevent the consumer from throwing away food or stopping them from producing or buying more food than they need. So that's one way in terms of controlling that. Another way would be planning. So plan what you need before you shop and reduce impulse and spontaneous buying. So if you buy what you need and you consume them as you need, it would reduce the possible potential for wasting. Education is key. So understand how to store and preserve food in an effective way, and in turn that will reduce the loss of food. Charity. Give away food before it expires. So ensure that unused food is used in some way. Example, give it to poor, use some of that to feed animals and pass them on to compost heaps that can then be returned back into the soil to sustain the requirements. Okay, so guys, we're almost wrapping up this session, and I'm going to quickly run through an overview of what we've done. So we've looked at food security, we've looked at factors that affect food security, we've looked at the different ranges of food security. We've also spoken about the cost of production of food and factors that affect that in the context of a developing country and a developed country. We've looked at an activity where we've compared food losses of developed countries to the food loss of developing countries. And we know that as a consumer market, countries that rely on subsistence farming tend to waste less food. However, our developed countries where there's large volumes of food produced that are high quality and there's a demand for that, people tend to waste more food. So it's important for us to understand that food that is present on the table has gone through a process of production, farming, and processing. And it's important for us to understand that there's a factor of cost implication on this. So yes, you might feel that you're just wasting a plate of food, but there's a series of individuals that have invested in the production of that food. It's hence important for us to remember that food security is something that we need to consider from the producer all the way up to the consumer. So guys, I want to wish you well, remind you of the food security that we have and the privileges that we have of being able to access that food, and remember to look after your environment, care for the food that is being produced, and consume that effectively and wisely. So from my side, thank you for tuning in. Go well, take care, and be safe.